everyone, I'm Trish Lynch from IOHR TV in London. You're very welcome to our show, NGO Focus. Islamist extremism has somehow gained a space in the public conscience as the only form of terrorism. But unfortunately, there is a parallel dimension brewing in our society where the swastika and the Nazi salute are shockingly still worshipped and where minorities are targeted. Right-wing extremists, sometimes moved by nationalistic, anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment, are operating all over Britain, plotting attacks and spreading hate speech. Hundreds of far-right extremists have been accused of participating in malicious plots. Today with us is Jemma Levene, Deputy Director of Hope Not Hate, which is a charity that monitors and uncovers hate groups and prevents extremism. Jemma, great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, can you tell us how Hope Not Hate started? Tell me how it all began.
So really our roots start with the Battle of Cable Street in the 1930s, fighting Oswald Mosley and his fascists in London's East End. And our movement grows from that. So a movement of ordinary people wanting to stand up to fascism in Britain.
Would you say that right-wing extremism is an underestimated threat here in the UK? Because according to the Global Terrorism Index, 66 people were murdered between 2013 and 2017 by right-wing groups and individuals. And we know that the UK alone has suffered 12 far-right terror attacks in 2017, among them the Finsbury Park mosque attack. Mm-hmm. Why is it such an underestimated threat?
I think it's really difficult to say. It's a very complex situation. What we have here, obviously, is that still Islamist-inspired attacks are the majority. But if you look at referrals to prevent, for example, over the last year, there's a massive increase in referrals on the far right. So I think perhaps one of the reasons it's underestimated is that it hasn't been, the numbers haven't been as large in the UK in terms of successful attacks. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons for that obviously is work by people like us. So because we've been monitoring the far right in the UK since really the 1930s, we've been able to infiltrate and expose and undermine some of that work, so that although there are lots of people holding these views, we've been able to hold back the tide.
Tell me about the connection between intelligence work and your research work.
The intelligence work will be everything from infiltrating far-right groups and other extremist groups through to monitoring them and keeping a careful eye on who's meeting whom. The research work will include digital research where we can track accounts online, mm-hmm. who's saying what online, who's talking to whom online, looking internationally as trends build. So, for example, there's an international movement called the Counter-Jihad movement, mm-hmm. which is an Antimuslim movement, which is international, and the players communicate and things build on an international level. So our research can be quite academic. We can run big reports where we can look at the international trends that are building, but that obviously feeds straight back into and is symbiotic with the intelligence work where we're looking at individual players on the ground. So the two things are very important, and obviously year on year our digital research work becomes more and more important. We have some real experts now mm-hmm. who are able to monitor what's going on Twitter, for example, and we are able to really be able to focus in on individual players. That is very useful for us, it's very useful for our partners, it's very useful for anybody in law enforcement or politicians, so that we can provide advice and information on individual characters as they come up mm-hmm. Into the public arena.
Can you tell me about your analysis on neo-Nazi groups who are based in the UK? Tell me how they operate and what they hope to achieve in the long term.
National Action is the first prescribed far-right terrorist group. So it's the first group prescribed as a terrorist group on the far right in this country. And that means that in theory, at least, they are no longer active. But of course, we were very concerned when they prescribed that what they would do is just change their name and go underground, which, you know, that's a pattern that we've seen with any kind of extremist group. They get into the spotlight, they can just change their name, they can just change where they meet, and they can carry on. And so we were very concerned that this is what was happening, which is why we would continue to monitor people that we were aware were involved in National Action. I think it's really important to think about the fact that people don't change their views overnight. So you might ban something, but the people who are involved aren't going to go anywhere.
Tell me how important social media has been to promoting this.
social media has been crucial. When I was growing up, your parents might say, avoid Dave at number 7 because we all know he's a bit of a racist. Whereas nowadays, your kids can be playing around online and they can stumble upon really hardcore racist material that's been originating in Australia or North America, anywhere across Europe, and it's coming straight into their inbox. It's anonymous, and there's no recourse against these people because you can set up an anonymous account. We can't necessarily track who and what is the originator of this, and it's a safe space for people to say anything that they like. And obviously, teenagers more than most are going to be vulnerable to fake news and to those kinds of narratives which take them further right than they maybe initially meant to go. And the algorithms within social media are built to enable that. So you're always fed more shocking material than what you just accessed.
As you mentioned earlier, in 2017, you noticed the police of an alleged plot to kill a Labour MP. Do you think that targeting left-wing politicians is now becoming a bit of a trend with these groups after the Joe Cox?
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because what we saw in the past week is actually a Conservative politician being targeted outside Parliament.
Yep.
So I think what we have to remember is these people are so angry and so hate-filled that anybody could potentially be vulnerable to being a target. And we see that women are much more vulnerable than men. Public women like MPs and like TV personalities are the most likely to be targeted, both online and offline.
You conducted hundreds of polls and you have understood that there are certain communities where these sentiments have really taken deep root. How can you help in changing the approach and the mindset within these communities?
Right. So one of the things we do at Hope Not Hate, we don't just research and run intelligence on the far right, but we do a lot of work in communities. So we really strongly believe that actually if communities are ignored and left behind and not given the support they need, then that is creating a vulnerability. So we do a lot of polling and a lot of data work, which can get us down to a very small geographic areas to show where people are going to be most vulnerable. And we can look to working with sort of the natural leaders within those communities, as well as the local council and local service providers. But often there'll be, natural superstars who, if you can go in there and say, would you like to see change in your community, they'll be prepared to step up. And that's, you could call it community organising, and that's something we do a lot of.
So when you go into communities and you can identify that, yes, there's a problem and people are angry, what's your first step in trying to change the mindset?
So what we normally do is look for small wins. So we will go and we'll speak to people about what are you angry about? Well, I'm angry about all the immigration. Okay, but why is that impacting you? Well, so a good example, when we were working in the East End to counter the BNP, going into tower blocks, really angry, and initially very unsophisticated responses. But once you actually start to have conversations, what people are really angry about is that nobody's fixed the lift in their tower block. And, the little old lady on their floor has to go down 15 flights of stairs and up again with her shopping. So then you can start a campaign going, well, why don't we start a residents group? Let's bring everybody together. Now, maybe the residents have never met really before, and certainly not to create positive change.
So it's a good vehicle from that point of view, isn't it? Get to know your community.
So get to know your community, find out what's really bothering people, find something that you can help fix and that they can be involved in help fixing, so they get that self-confidence back that they have got a voice and they can make change. And then when they get targeted by whether it's racist political parties, far-right political parties or other fringe groups, they can say, we're not interested because we've got a better way of fixing things. We don't need you. You're not changing anything for us.
And what has the response been like once you've brought these people together? What have they said to you?
Yeah, so that, obviously it's amazing to see people growing in self-confidence, communities coming together, change happening, and the resilience lasts. It's not a flash in the pan that goes through an electoral cycle. The resilience that you can build in a community can really last. People, everybody wants to be proud of where they live. So once you've created that sense of pride, that's something that you can only build on.
Tell me, if you would, how common anti-Muslim hatred is within these groups. Now, I've read that it's replacing the old-fashioned, if you like, racial nationalism.
Yeah, anti-Muslim hatred is probably the biggest form of prejudice in this country today. We've got shocking statistics that show, for example, that more people in the UK think there are Muslim no-go areas that are ruled by Sharia law than people who don't think that. So what's really interesting here is it's become very, very mainstream, and people particularly people living in areas where they don't interact with Muslims, so people living in rural market towns, in outlying communities, in very white estates will be more prone to having picked up on some of the negative messaging, either from the media or from the internet, and really there's no sense of myth busting there because they're not coming into contact with Muslims. And the other thing we found when we ran our national conversation on immigration last year is that there's a real difference between local and national. So someone will be able to express, well, you know, the people who are a bit different from me on my street, they're all right, they're nice, so I like them. But do you know what's happening in the big cities? You know, they're taking over. So it's very interesting that people on a local level are able to relate to people who are different to them, but their concern on a national level about immigration and particularly about integration is huge.
Now, as you said, that many young Islamist extremists join these groups because they feel that they're on the outside, they feel that they're not understood, or it could be something as simple as the lift not working. Are the triggers the same for young white men, or is it a totally different system?
The triggers are the same, but I think for young white men particularly, there's such a sense of exclusion and there's such a sense of anger. No one is listening to them, and they are being fed nonsense really about the fact that they are second-class citizens and that minorities have got it better than them. So it's very toxic because they have genuine reasons for being angry. They are genuinely disenfranchised, but they're also being fed a lot of disinformation about what the causes for their own struggles are.
Many people have said that it's almost like a coin. On one side, you have got the Islamists, and on the other side, you have the far-right extremism. Do you believe this? Is there a connection between the two?
Yes, there's definitely a connection. And not just that, but there's a connection in terms of fear as well, obviously. So after the Westminster attacks, polling that we did showed that the terrorist attacks made more people more fearful of Muslims generally. But obviously it's very much a tit for tat. So you will have people on the far right stirring up more hatred and pushing for more direct action and more violence after an attempted or a successful Islamist terror attack or a similar action. So yes, they do very, very much feed off each other. And what we've also found is that organisations like National Action have actually used some of the methodology from the Islamist extremist groups. So they've picked up on the way that they recruit, and so for example, running training camps in the country where they, and being very physically fit, they've picked that up from the way that Islamist groups work too.
Jemma Levene, we thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for another episode of NGO Focus. Please feel free to share this episode with as many people as you can. And don't forget, you can also see some of our other NGO focuses on this site too. Until next time, from myself, Trish Lynch, goodbye.